Ya estamos de regreso y para adentrarnos en la cuarta presentación de esta mañana, deseamos recordarles a ustedes que esta presentación que se realiza a continuación es una presentación en el idioma inglés. Por lo tanto, si ustedes desean escuchar la presentación en idioma español, rogamos por favor acceder a la sala que dice traducción para poder entonces escuchar la ponencia en el idioma español. Del mismo modo les recordamos y les solicitamos que en el transcurso de la presentación ustedes puedan ir ingresando sus consultas para que al final de la ponencia la doctora Millar pueda realizar todas las respuestas a las inquietudes que ustedes tengan en esta instancia. Durante los últimos años hemos visto cómo la opinión pública genera un endoso creciente del sector ganadero, y esto a nivel mundial, de una parte importante de los problemas medioambientales que tiene el planeta. Recientemente veíamos la presentación de INI en Chile y de cómo se empiezan a recabar datos para poder tener alguna herramienta para presentar y generar una defensa o una mitigación de los efectos. Por ello, es de sumo interés conocer el camino que un país ganadero como Escocia ha podido transitar en materia medioambiental. Contaremos a continuación con la participación de Sarah Millar, directora de Inteligencia de Mercado y Vinculación con el Medio de Quality Meat Scotland. Ella participa activamente del desarrollo y ejecución de programas institucionales para mejorar la calidad y eficiencia de la producción primaria de carne roja y su cadena de suministro en Escocia. Dejamos entonces a Sarah Millar, quien presentará el tema Sustentabilidad ganadera, la historia escocesa. Muchas gracias. Sara, por favor, cuando usted estime conveniente.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having us along to speak to you today at your seminar. And I am very much wishing I was speaking to you in Chile, in a sunny Chile, rather than in a rainy Scotland today. So I'm just going to take you through a bit of detail about Scotland and what we are doing to bring a more sustainable red meat product through the supply chain, and how we are meeting our climate change targets that our Scottish Government have set down in front of us. So, apologies, my slides aren't moving. There we go. So, first of all, and I think we all know this, I think we all know that not all meat is created equally. Not all meat is produced in the same way, and there are many different ways to take a live animal through the production chain when it ends up on our plates. And the way that we do that has a significant impact on how we manage our land, how we manage and how we restore and protect nature and biodiversity. And that's what we need to be able to do to enable us to produce a sustainable red meat product. We need to be able to utilise the resources that we have available to us in the most natural way possible. So really, when we think about this, what makes Scotland different and what really paints that picture of Scottish sustainability? Scotland's famed as a country worldwide for its livestock. We all know Aberdeen Angus cattle, blackface sheep, and many other prominent red meat producing nations have utilised the resources in that livestock that Scotland has given them over the years. So that really means that Scotland is the home of livestock production. And that's really because of two unique characteristics. So Scotland has what I call the perfect recipe for sustainable red meat production. We have the climate, which, as I mentioned earlier, it rains a lot. It's a cool climate, which means that our animals have a very good health status. They don't get disease as much because the disease can't spread as much. And we also have a good grass growing landscape, which really is the perfect components and the base components that we need to base our sustainability story on. Scotland, as you know, is famed for its rugged landscape, such as this that you can see on screen. And 85% of Scotland's farmland is officially classified by the EU as less favoured areas. And of that 85%, which is over 4 million hectares of land, which means that can't support any other type of farming other than livestock farming and grass production. There are 35,000 businesses across Scotland reliant on that. And the vast majority, I would say 95% of those businesses are producing livestock. So livestock are intrinsically linked to the health of that land and are the predominant business activity that is undertaken on that land as well. So when we think about sustainability, what is sustainability? How do we measure it and how do we manage it? For us, there are three key pillars to sustainability. And these three pillars can't be seen in isolation. They are all intrinsically linked. And if you imagine, I always think of the analogy of a three-legged stool. If you pull away one of these pillars, economic, social, or environment, the stool falls over. So we need to make sure that when we are building resilience and sustainability into our systems, we're looking at all three of these components of the economic, the social, and the environment. So when we look at our economic sustainability, this is just a bit of a snapshot, and Alan took you through some of this earlier. So our red meat industry is worth £2 billion to the Scottish economy in total, and our total income from farming in 2020, including government subsidies, was 791 million. Now, the graph that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen there shows what that total income from farming is without subsidies, because Scottish farming, we receive government money to undertake specific practices, and that is incredibly important to the profitability of our industry. Without that subsidy, you're just under £300 million worth of total income from farming, and the majority of that is in the arable and dairy sectors. Red meat production typically loses about £17,000 per business, based on an average. So economic sustainability isn't something that the sector currently has, and is a key feature of one of the things that we are working actively with government to try and improve. And is one of the issues that, if we are to look at when we talk about environmental sustainability later, we need to improve economic sustainability so that we have businesses that are able to invest in their land, in their practices, and that are sustainable in terms of their business output. If we then move over to social sustainability, and this is something that is incredibly important to Scotland, any of you who will have visited will know that Scotland is characterised by quite a remote landscape. We have many farms and crofts that are in very remote areas of Scotland, including we have an island network up in the north of Scotland, up in the Shetlands and the Orkney Isles, and on our west coast. And the majority of farms in Scotland are family owned. So that means you have, a multi-generations, mothers, grandfathers, and then children working on the same family business. And they're not probably just doing that for a business outcome. They have been there for many years, and they have a connection to the land, and they have a connection to the local area from which they farm within. One of the other key characteristics of our Scottish farming system and our red meat production system is the Scottish crofting system. Some of you may have heard about this, because crofting is incredibly important to Scotland's history and Scotland's heritage. If you hear about the Highland clearances, the Highland clearances was the clearing of crofts during the Industrial Revolution. And that, of course, meant that many Scottish people ended up all over the world, including in South America, Chile, Argentina, in Australia and New Zealand. But the crofting system is still an incredibly important part of Scotland's farming fabric. And where the crofting system is here in the area highlighted on the map up in that north and west coast of Scotland is also where the majority of our less favoured area is. What that means is that a lot of these crofts, they are producing livestock that are then sold into the Scotch beef, Scotch lamb brands. And by keeping that crofting community alive and that social fabric of these remote areas, you get those social structures and communication structures that allow Scotland to have a rural economy in very remote areas. So instead of driving, hundreds of miles and just being a barren wasteland, we have communities, we have tourism industries that are being kept alive because of livestock production taking place in these remote areas. And that's incredibly important, because if we want to, you know, going back to that three-legged stool and keeping that social sustainability alive, we need to be able to keep the crofting communities and our smaller family farms who are working in remote areas of Scotland and providing other services to tourists and providing other areas of the economy. It's about making sure that we can deliver value to these businesses as well. And then moving over to as well the main part of this, and this is our environmental sustainability, which is an issue that, as Leslie said in her marketing presentation, has moved much higher up the agenda in the last few years. And really that environmental sustainability can be split into two main pillars. So we've got biodiversity and nature restoration, and we have climate change. And I always, whenever I present and whenever we talk about environmental sustainability, I'm always very careful to split these two themes up, because there's a big difference between a production system, a farming production system that is very, very climate smart, and a production system that manages land in a way that enhances and restores biodiversity. So we need to make sure that these two elements are always in balance. And as I mentioned, you know, we go back to Scotland's unique landscape that we are farming in. So over 20% of Scotland is covered by what's called peatland, which is a deep carbon-rich soil, typically of over 35% organic matter, and has been formed over thousands of years. And this is a real gem in terms of how we can tackle climate change in Scotland, because those carbon stores hold an estimated 140 years worth of Scotland's annual greenhouse gas emissions. And they are also the areas where our Scottish cattle and Scottish sheep graze in that northwest Highland area. So managing these areas and grazing these areas for the environment and at the correct grazing pressure enables us to keep these peatlands in a good condition, and enables us to keep storing carbon in these areas. So the implication is if we didn't have a thriving red meat sector and a thriving route to market for our livestock that comes through and ends up as a red meat product, we would not be able to manage these areas of peatlands in the way that they need to be managed. And that's really, really important. And that is the key to Scotland meeting its climate change targets, is the management of these carbon stores. We also have a number of high nature value farming systems in Scotland, and again, you'll be very aware Scotland is home to some beautiful and iconic species. We've got capercaillie, we've got golden eagles, we've got curlews, we've got all sorts of other wager birds and biodiversity across the country. And the reason that we are able to support the type of habitats that these animals need is because our livestock industry is generally grazed at a very low grazing pressure. We have a low stocking density that allows these habitats to be grazed in a natural way that mimics nature. It's that regenerative farming system. Scotland, because of the key components that we have a naturally regenerative farming system, which is incredibly exciting for us. And makes our job a lot easier when it comes to nature restoration. There's always more that we can do, and we at QMS are very proud to work with Nature Conservation, Nature Scot, to look at ways that we can further drive farmers and change in our farming practices to make sure that we are protecting our landscape and that we are working in harmony with nature. And for example, our Monitor Farm programme over the last few years has looked at ways to manage habitats differently, to put agri-environment schemes in place to restore specific habitats. There's always more that we can do, but we're very proud of the reputation and the work that we have done, which has seen gains to our protected environmental areas. And it has only been possible because of grazing livestock, because of the way that we graze our livestock in that very natural way. Moving on to the climate challenge, and this is one that you guys will all be very familiar with. So we have quite a bit of a range in our emissions between different enterprises. You'll see here on the two graphs here, particularly in our hill cows and hill ewe systems. And that is because in some systems we will have cattle and sheep grazing over a very large area, so you don't get the output that you require. But the flip side of that coin is, well, you don't get the output, you do get the conservation grazing that you need to manage for habitats and for biodiversity management. So one of our key conundrums over the work that we're doing at QMS is how do we bring that average emissions level down so that the higher end, as you can see here, here and here, so that the higher end of emissions are brought down to the average of emissions, i.e. let's improve the middle 50% of farmers so that they operate in farming practices that are more like the top 25%. And that enables us to continue managing that land in a way that is beneficial to nature, whilst also bringing our carbon emissions down. So we're continually looking to improve, but also looking not just at climate change, but that wider environment and sustainability piece. So, you know, what is Scotland's ambition when it comes to climate change? So our Scottish government have incredibly ambitious targets. So there was a piece of legislation brought in late in 2019 where the Scottish government has committed every area of the Scottish economy to meet net zero by 2045. Alongside that, they've put in some interim targets, including a 75% reduction in emissions by 2030. And these are based on 1990 emission levels. So these are incredibly ambitious targets that have been calculated in a way that, for example, us in agriculture, like I said, we need to be able to meet net zero, but the key word here is net zero. We know because of methane systems and intrinsic emissions that are associated with live animals, that we're never going to have absolute zero emissions associated, but we need to produce calories, we need to produce food from the land base that we have. Therefore, if we can manage that land base to increase the storage of carbon, and particularly increase the storage of carbon within the peatlands that we have, that gives us a really, really positive story, and we should easily be able to meet that net zero target by 2045. And this is some of the work that we're doing at QMS. As a non-departmental public body, we're working very closely with government to design pathways to transition our farmers to low carbon production practices. So the methodology that we have been using is to set up a network of farmer-led groups where farmers come together and say, okay, these are the production practices that I can implement on my farm that will help my emissions lower. And they're really focused on three key areas, those being land management, genetics, and feed conversion ratio. So the three of those coming together, and because Scotland has quite a diverse landscape, we need to make sure that we give power to farmers to do this, rather than trying to say this is absolutely the production process you need to go through. The other really important aspect of this, and I mention this because I spoke about social sustainability earlier, is alongside the Climate Change Act and the Climate Change Implementation Plan, which is updated yearly by the government, we also have something called the Just Transition Commission, which is a separate group set up by government, which have been looking at how communities can transition to net zero and making sure that no community is left behind. And that's incredibly important for us as a livestock producing community, where we have communities existing in very remote rural parts of Scotland who are providing services to other areas of the community. Because the implication is that if one sector is targeted too much and isn't given the time and space to transition to net zero how it needs to, you then start to you suffer massive rural depopulation, and that then impacts on how we can manage the environment in that much wider environmental sense. So it's constantly trying to keep things in a balance as we're moving to these new production practices and moving towards net zero. And just thinking about what our role is here as a levy board. So you heard from Alan and Leslie about how we integrate all our activities and then right through into how we manage our marketing campaigns. So as a levy board, we have whole of supply chain assurance, which is a massive lever that we can pull when trying to change farming practices to make sure that livestock are managed in a way that reduces their carbon emissions. So our whole of supply chain assurance scheme, we're currently undergoing a review to look at how we can put in standards that encourage farmers to be more sustainable. So the important link there is that if we can build sustainability into our standards, that then means that our marketing campaign and our brands can be labelled as such, and they can be labelled as a sustainable brand. So what we're always trying to do is join up what the consumers are looking for with how our farmers manage their land and manage their livestock. Because the only way that we can increase the amount of money going into the red meat value chain is by increasing the amount that consumers are paying and by increasing the demand that consumers have for our red meat products. So it's trying to keep the two things in balance. How do we move farmers into producing livestock and red meat in a more sustainable way? And how can we communicate that back to consumers? And the assurance schemes are absolutely a vital tool in doing that and give that integrity. You know, we're not just making a claim, we have the data and the auditability behind that to give that confidence to consumers. We've also done quite a bit of work. So Quality Meat Scotland is one organisation in Scotland, but there's a number of other red meat industry bodies that exist. We have a working group called the Scottish Red Meat Resilience Group, and that consists of membership organisations from processors through to auction markets, through to marketing bodies. And we come together to produce collaborative position papers and collaborative action plans on specific topics. So we have been working with them on a specific COP26 and UN Food System Summit programme of activity. Now, obviously, COP26 is incredibly exciting, coming to Glasgow in November, which is a huge opportunity for us in Scotland to showcase what we are doing with our red meat producers and to protect the environment and to achieve net zero. We're working with our partners on a few different things. We have a communications campaign that will be going out aimed at consumers. We will have a separate communications campaign aimed at producers, but we're also looking at could we host a more global red meat focus event in Glasgow on behalf of the global red meat industry because of the COVID situation. So that we are able to showcase our industry in the best light and get our positive messages across. We're looking forward to working with you all in Chile if you're interested in being part of that. We're also working with, obviously, Scotland is one part of the United Kingdom. We are working with other devolved nations in England and Wales and Northern Ireland on sharing data and developing aligned policy messages around COP, because it is such an opportunity to face what we do and to create change with decision makers, but we need to work together to do that and make sure that red meat is seen as in a positive light in what is going to be a very, very important 2 weeks as they thrash out the next level of climate negotiations. As I said, when we do all this work around, negating that space around climate sustainability, we need to be able to talk to consumers about this in a way that they understand. So Leslie and her team have worked incredibly hard over the last year in how we do that. So we published this year a publication called Having Positive Conversations About Red Meat. And what we did was look at some very high level statistics around Scottish red meat production. So for example, we can say that UK beef and lamb has a carbon emission that is 35% lower than the average global based on 2016 data. We know that our weather and topography, as I said earlier, is one of the most sustainable places to produce beef and lamb. It is literally a natural product that is suited to our landscape, and you could almost say that Scotland is the home of beef production, and always has been. And again, going back to our unique landscape and that carbon capture that our peatlands in particular do, and providing that area for wildflowers and biodiversity. These are all important things that consumers are interested in. So being able to tell them that, and it sometimes seems like a really, really obvious thing to do, but when we're doing something, we need to shout about it, and we need to tell people, because we see in Scotland a massive disconnect between people who live in cities and people who live in rural areas. We also have, obviously, over 90% of beef and sheep are fed on grassland, silage and brewer's grain. So we're not importing huge amounts of feed. There's occasionally a bit of grain used to finish cattle, but the majority of our livestock are fed again on natural products produced in Scotland. And that's really it for me. And this all fits into all parts of our strategy across supporting, developing, promoting and protecting. So where we need to develop our environment and our sustainability story is critical to everything that we do. And it's become it's top of our agenda at the moment, and it's something that we're very excited about because we know we've got a positive story to tell. So I will finish there, and please ask any questions as you see fit.
Muchísimas gracias, Sara. Hay un factor, digamos, muy interesante en la unión entre la producción que tienen ustedes en Escocia, la protección de los ecosistemas y la forma como ustedes muestran esto en un equilibrio que, a pesar de ser frágil, se presenta con mucha delicadeza. Así que agradecemos muchísimo la forma en cómo ustedes están enfocando este tema.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, your presentation, and it was very interesting to see the way that you have a union between the production and the ecosystem, the way that you show it. We know it's very fragile, but we can see how it has been productive. It's been successful.
Thank you, no problem.
Gracias, ni un problema.
Hay una consulta respecto a cuáles son las expectativas que ustedes tienen como sede de la próxima COP26 y el impacto de la ganadería, que es muy probablemente un tema que va a estar muy presente en esta ocasión.
She would like to know what are your expectations for hosting the COP26, and of course she knows that the livestock will be a very heated subject there in this event.
So our expectation, as you said, we know that people are going to be looking at COP26 as a turning point in how climate is discussed at a very high level. So, and they're going to be focusing on calls to action on consumers and citizens and individuals. So what we are looking to do in that is to make sure that our messaging is showing consumers that they can be climate heroes by making a choice to buy Scotch beef, Scotch lamb and special selected pork. Because like I said earlier, not all meat is created equally. And we know that under the right conditions, under the right production systems, red meat can be produced in a way that is good for climate because we are minimising emissions. We are working with nature to store carbon in the soil through the ways that we graze. And we can also work with nature because biodiversity is equally as important. I think the thing to remember as well that COP26 in Glasgow is coming at the end of 3 very important conferences. We've got the UN Food Systems Summit taking place in September. We've got the COP15 Biodiversity Conference taking place in China in October. Then we've got COP26 taking place in Glasgow in November, and I don't think that's any accident. Like I said, when we talk about sustainability, we need to have, essentially our food system, which drives our economic sustainability, alongside our biodiversity and our environmental sustainability, alongside how we tackle climate change. The crux of the matter is, in Scotland, we could reduce our emissions to a very, very low level by intensifying our production practices. But that would have a negative impact on how we manage the land. It would have a negative impact on our social structures. You wouldn't see anyone living north of Perth. And you would also see a negative impact on biodiversity and nature, which is not what we want to see. So we need to view these things much more holistically and make sure that we are telling consumers and explaining to them the benefits of eating red meat produced in systems that are kind and complementary to nature.
Harto largo la respuesta, espero poder contestarlo todo. Nosotros sabemos que el COP26 va a ser un punto de quiebre en todas estas discusiones acerca de lo que son el cambio climático, por ejemplo. Van a haber muchos que van a estar hablando de eliminaciones y acciones en cuanto a los consumidores y los individuos. Y ellos quieren asegurar que los consumidores sepan que ellos pueden ser héroes en cuanto al clima, en consumir la carne, o sea, si la carne roja, el de bovino y también del puerco que viene o porcina que viene de Escocia, porque la carne roja que ellos producen está hecha en forma natural y ellos también están tomando mucho cuidado en cuanto a las praderas y en cuanto a la naturaleza en su biodiversidad. Y lo que dice ella también es que el COP26 que va a ser en Glasgow va a ser después de 3 conferencias muy importantes. Uno será en septiembre, el otro será el COP15 en China, que será en octubre. Después viene el COP26, que es el Glasgow, que será en noviembre. Y ella quiere decir que van a hablar acerca de la sustentabilidad del alimento, que es muy importante para las personas. Y ella dijo que van a ver cómo ellos van a atacar esto de la sustentabilidad del ambiente, que las emisiones que ellos emiten es muy, muy baja, que el impacto negativo va a ser muy, 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 muy baja, y también que la forma que ellos manejan de la tierra, la pradera, va a tener un impacto negativo, pero también ellos quieren tener un impacto negativo en cuanto a la parte social, como ella habló que tienen muchos predios afuera en los lugares más remotos. Entonces ellos tienen que trabajar en una forma más holística, contando la historia de cómo ellos han bajado muchas sus emisiones en la forma que producen su carne roja.
Muchas gracias. Queremos agradecer a Sara por su presentación y reiterar nuestros agradecimientos a Quality Made Scotland, porque han sido 3 presentaciones muy, muy interesantes, cada una en su ámbito, y estamos seguros que para nosotros en Chile gran parte de la información que ustedes han mostrado es absolutamente importante para el camino que queremos seguir, al menos en la cadena cárnica y en la Corporación de la Carne. Así que solo agradecer a Sara, despedirla, liberarla de la presentación, y nosotros terminamos esta presentación y volvemos en 2 minutos más con los datos de consumo de carne en Chile con el doctor Gastón Escudero. Así que no se vayan.